So anyway, good evening and welcome everybody. My name is Susan Hay and I am president of Environment Halliburton. This event featuring Dr. Jennifer Penney is co-sponsored by Environment Halliburton and Seniors for Climate Action Now, also known as SCAN. After watching the extreme weather events across the world over the past year and more, this topic is of great interest to everyone, no matter where they live. A couple of housekeeping items before we get started. I would ask that you please stay muted during the presentation, and if you have a question, please type it into the chat function. Terry Moore will be curating the questions and will direct them to Jennifer at the end of her presentation. I would now like to invite Environment Halliburton Board member Christine Lake to offer a brief land acknowledgement. Christine?
Thank you, Susan. Stan Rushworth, an Indigenous elder of Cherokee descent, reminds us of the difference between a Western settler mindset of I have rights and an Indigenous mindset of I have obligations. Instead of thinking that I am born with rights, I choose to think that I am born with obligations to serve past, present, and future generations and the planet herself.
Thanks, Christine. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jennifer Penney. Jennifer has a doctorate in work environment policy from the University of Massachusetts Lowell. She worked for many years in occupational health and safety. From 2004 to 2010, she was Director of Research at the Clean Air Partnership, where she led research and training programs and organized conferences and webinar series on climate change impacts and adaptation for municipalities. She was the principal author of the City of Toronto's first adaptation strategy, adopted in 2008. Jennifer chairs SCAN's Adaptation Working Group. She was the main author for Bill 198, an act providing a climate change adaptation for Ontario, tabled in the Ontario legislature this year. And now, Jennifer, I will turn the meeting over to you.
Thanks very much, Susan. I appreciate your invitation to speak today and to your invitation and Environment Halliburton's invitation as well to speak to present to you today. I'm going to start by saying, for some reason, I'm extremely nervous tonight. I'm actually quite used to doing presentations, but this one, for some reason, has become particularly difficult. So bear with me if I'm forgetting some words or getting scratchy in the throat or whatever. I first talked to Susan about this presentation after two major hurricanes had just blown through the southeast of the United States, leaving devastation and death in their wake. I'm sure most of you saw those news reports. Susan thought it was really important for people in Halliburton and elsewhere to know more about the impacts of climate change from extreme weather and how to adapt to protect ourselves from it. So this presentation focuses on extreme weather. It also focuses to some extent on Halliburton, though I believe there is information of value to other people from other communities who are listening in. And as I'm sure most of you know, global warming also creates other slower moving changes or changes that don't seem so extreme at a moment in any particular movement. And I will not get into these today, though some of these are likely to have profound impacts on our lives, and especially on the lives of our children and grandchildren. So I should say about this presentation, it is quite text heavy, and it tries to cover a lot of ground. I'm going to ask Environmental Halliburton to forward it to you by email. You will have the emails as a result of registrations for this presentation. So if you are a note taker like I usually am when I'm on webinars and so on, you can sit back and hopefully relax. So I'm going to share my screen now. And there we are. So this photograph was lifted from a Halliburton area newspaper, and I don't remember right at the moment. Highlander, there it is. I could hardly see it. in 2022 when a storm was predicted to be rolling in. So that's that. Yeah. But let's plunge in. Just want to do a quick recap of the greenhouse effect. I think most of you probably know a lot about this, but it doesn't hurt to kind of go back over it again. So when you look at this graphic, you can see the yellow arrows symbolize the solar radiation that enters the Earth's atmosphere from the sun and comes down, and it's absorbed at the surface of the planet, both in the land and in the water. The orange arrows show heat being emitted from the Earth's surface back into the atmosphere. Now, carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, which are represented by the little kind of gray dots in the atmosphere, reflect much of that heat back again to the Earth's surface. And something that's called the greenhouse effect, and which allows life to occur on Earth. Unfortunately, the more greenhouse gases that we have in the atmosphere, the more heat is reflected back, and the more the Earth warms up. So if we look at the U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration does daily readings of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So the last one I looked at was in November the 12th, and the level of CO2 in the atmosphere on that date was 423.3 parts per million. Now this compares to 275 parts per million, which was the average before the Industrial Revolution and before we started to put major amounts of fossil fuels into the atmosphere. 350 parts per million is kind of considered safe, although I must say I worry a little bit about that when we see how much impact we're getting from the levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere now. If you look at the chart, which you can't see all of, I don't think, on the right-hand side, you'll see how those emissions have risen basically since 1960 when those measurements began in Hawaii. When I first started to look at climate change, it was sort of in the mid-1990s, and the levels at that time were at about the 350 parts per million level. So they've been going up quite rapidly. Now, along with those rapid increases in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, the Earth's average surface temperature has been going up. So again, at the time of the Industrial Revolution, the average Earth's surface temperature was estimated to be at about 15 degrees C. Right now, it's closer to 16.5 degrees C. That's 1.5 degrees higher than the average for the 51 to 1980 period. And it's part of the target of the Paris Accord in 2015 not to let temperatures get any higher than this. When we think about this, this 16.5 degrees C is an average temperature for the whole of the Earth's surface. So this includes the Arctic, the Antarctic, Greenland, which is covered with a major ice sheet, the equatorial regions, the oceans, the Himalayas, night and day, winter and summer, and so on. So it's an average temperature. When you think about that, you think about the average temperature of this massive area going up by 1 to 2 to 3 degrees doesn't seem that big, right? What's 1 or 2 degrees? It doesn't make very much difference when we think about our springtime temperatures or our fall temperatures or even our winter temperatures. It doesn't make a lot of difference, but it does make a lot of difference to a lot of conditions on the planet. So you can see here, these bell curves represent the previous climate and the new climate as it's occurring. And these bell curves are going to move more and more to the right as greenhouse gases concentrate in the environment and as, I'm sorry, I get distracted by the emit signs. and as average temperatures at the Earth's surface go up. And so you can see that on the left-hand side, the kind of cold extremes that would have occurred more under the previous climate are reduced, although we're still going to get some fairly extreme winters, and I can talk a little bit about that later. And the incidence of hot weather is increasing, and of extreme hot weather is increasing dramatically. So these changes, of course, are fueled by greenhouse gas emissions, which are largely a result of burning fossil fuels. And it's stunning to think about, but in 2024, our emissions went up by 8%. So this is despite all the nations of the planet agreeing in 2015 in Paris to reduce emissions so that we wouldn't have these kinds of temperature extremes occurring. 37.4 billion metric tons of fossil fuels are estimated to have been released in 2024, largely from oil and gas production and distribution, from use of that oil and gas, coal and oil and gas, in electricity production, in transportation, in industry, and so on. So agriculture and land use and forestry also contribute a great deal to greenhouse gas emissions. So livestock, the amount of livestock that's being produced around the world, and the manure from the livestock is creating huge methane emissions that also warm the planet. The use of synthetic fertilizers and a lot of soil tillage increase the emissions as well, and of course deforestation and the building of towns and spreading out over natural environments. So these surging greenhouse gases and increasing surface temperatures are the cause of a lot of our extreme weather. Of course, extreme weather did exist previously, but we're getting more of it and it's more intense. So warmer air leads to more and hotter heat waves, as we've seen already. It also leads to more periods of drought, and it leads to more wildfires as it changes conditions in forests and in other areas where wildfires occur, and those fires are ignited and burn intensely. Heat also means that the atmosphere can hold more water vapor. And with more water vapor, when rain comes down, it can come down and does come down as more intense rain falls. Similarly, hotter air, hotter temperatures in the atmosphere can create more energy, so that when we have thunderstorms, for example, we get stronger straight line wind gusts, also known as derechos and downdrafts, that can really impact our buildings and forests and woods and so on. And that energy also results in more intense cyclonic storms, tornadoes and hurricanes. I'll talk a little bit more about those in a minute. So how is this playing out internationally? Well, just this year, we've seen massive extreme drought in the Amazon. The map on the right shows the Amazon basin, which usually shows up as green. If we look at maps or we look at photos of the Amazon basin, we see this massive green forest, even though it's being eaten at bit by bit as forests are burned for agriculture and so on. And that Amazon system has been really important as a stabilizing feature for climate on Earth. We also have seen massive heat waves in India that killed thousands of people. It actually reminds me, I don't know if any of you have read a book called The Ministry of the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson. It's kind of a speculative fiction, but it opens in the first chapter with heat waves in India that kill literally millions of people. And the descriptions are so clear about how that happens, that it's not only that people's bodies can't withstand 50 degree centigrade temperatures for extended periods, but that the water heats up, that the power systems go out, and that vulnerable people start in small numbers to die, and they go into hot water. They go into lakes and hot water, but the water heats up and it doesn't help them cool down at all. It's a dramatic account that I think we're beginning to see in some areas. We also had in 2024 Beryl, Helen, and Milton hurricanes that crossed through the southeastern USA, crossing areas of the USA that haven't been generally affected by hurricanes previously, and brought down deluges of water, flooding, winds that destroyed buildings and infrastructure. In October 29th and 30th, and since that period, we've had extreme fall and catastrophic rain in Spain. And it's led to pictures like these, where water surged through towns and cities and upended vehicles, piling them on top of one another. The floods were so strong and so fast and so hard, and lots of people were killed in their vehicles and in other areas of the flood. So climate change has also brought really fierce weather to Canada. Over the last 3 or 4 years, we've seen a lot of dramatic events. So we saw BC's heat dome in 2021, which hovered over BC and Washington State and Oregon, and in BC killed 619 people. I'm not quite sure how many they killed in Washington and Oregon, but both states were dramatically affected. And this was followed in BC by an atmospheric river that flooded huge amounts of the lower mainland. It caused mudslides, took out roads, took out bridges, took out rail lines, stopped goods flowing across the regions and backed those goods up dramatically. In Ontario and Quebec last year, we saw this whole series of derechos. We saw this line of thunderstorms traveling from the Windsor to Quebec corridor. Over 1,000 kilometers of damage occurred during these derechos, particularly in the Ottawa region. It downed thousands of trees, 1,900 hydro poles, 5 transmission towers, and killed at least 10 people. Atlantic Canada had a hurricane, which is unusual. By the time hurricanes come up the East Coast and hit Canada, they've usually reduced to tropical storms. They're still problematic, but they aren't at the level of power that these hurricanes have. But this one got to Atlantic Canada, and it caused 25 deaths, displaced 13,000 people, cost $4 billion in damages. We also this year had intense rains and flash floods in southern Ontario, especially around the Toronto and the Greater Toronto area, for example, Mississauga. It did almost $1 billion in insured damage. And I'll talk a little bit later about insurance and insured damages. And of course, in 2023, this dramatic set of wildfires that were 4 times that had occurred in any previous year across Canada, more than 6,000 wildfires in total that burned over 16.5 million hectares. I don't quite remember how that transfers to acres, but it's a lot more acres than that. So who are the most vulnerable to these events? Well, people who are poor, people who are marginalized, Indigenous people, particularly in Canada, we see huge numbers of Indigenous people affected, especially by floods in the north, but also increasingly by forest fires and heat. Elderly and isolated individuals are also very vulnerable to these kinds of conditions. People living with certain kinds of medical conditions, with asthma, for example, or heart or cardiac effects, are very affected by these things. Particularly, they can't necessarily get out of regions that are being affected by extreme weather, and their bodies just aren't as resilient as they were when you're younger. I really feel this when I'm working on my son's farm in the heat. the heat stress gets to me much more than it did when I was a lot younger. People living in substandard housing, of course, are affected by these storms that damage their roofs, that flood their rooms and so on, their basements. People living in low-lying regions, particularly on the coast, but also on floodplains, river floodplains, and near or in the boreal forest. There's huge vulnerability. Nature and wildlife have a lot of vulnerability as well. I'm not going to get into this today. It really deserves a presentation just on its own, but I didn't want to short it completely. I think it's really important to think about how nature and wildlife is affected by heat and floods and wildfires. And I think people in Haliburton who live much closer to nature than people where I usually live in Toronto can see these kinds of changes. So how do we reduce the impacts of climate change? Well, there's two broad areas of action. One is what we've referred to in the climate movement as mitigation, which is to reduce the emissions that will avoid future climate change impacts, but basically over the long term. And the second set of actions that we can take is adaptation actions. We're implementing measures that protect us against impacts that are already underway. So mitigation helps more with future impacts, partly because climate change is already baked in. When carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere, it's quite slow to come out. So as we have added to those atmospheric concentrations, they stay there for a long time, and they're going to continue to cause extreme weather. So if we look at a couple of areas where we might take action, either for mitigation or adaptation. So for example, in our electricity system, if we're trying to reduce emissions, we're talking about things like shifting to renewable energy away from fossil fuels, like solar, wind, geothermal, and hydro power. If we're looking at the electricity system from an adaptation perspective, we're looking at designing electricity production and transmission systems in such a way as to protect them and avoid power outages that have such impacts on our populations. So taking different takes on that system for reducing emissions on the one hand versus measures that will protect us on the other hand. Around forests, protecting and expanding forests to absorb carbon is something that we want to do to reduce emissions, to mitigate. On the adaptation side, we want to protect forests and wetlands because they help protect us against flooding. They absorb a lot of moisture, and they protect us from the kinds of floods that are happening. The more we take those out, the more floods we're going to have. Around buildings, the mitigation would involve retrofitting buildings to reduce energy use, for example. Whereas on the adaptation side, we would retrofit buildings to protect against heat and storms. Sometimes the things we would do to do both of those things, adding insulation to buildings, making windows, I'm trying to think of what, better windows. I'm forgetting the particular words there, but better windows and so on will both reduce our energy use in buildings and the use of fossil fuels for heating and cooling, and they'll also help to protect us against heat and storms. So just to make the point with adaptation has been the kind of poor cousin in climate action. It's not that we're doing mitigation enough, but adaptation has had even less attention and certainly less resources put to it. But mitigation is clearly not enough. We have to start making things safer in our communities so that people aren't ill and die and so on. Mitigation is simply not enough. We have to turn to adaptation as well. Their impacts, as I've indicated before, are baked in for centuries to come. The other thing about adaptation that's really important is because the people who are most vulnerable to climate impacts are the poor and the elderly and the other vulnerable populations. Adaptation brings social justice for those people. It levels the playing field if it's done right, and it's really important for that reason. The other thing about putting attention to adaptation is that the kinds of costs that occur as a result of climate impacts, this $1 billion that was spent as a result of, or is being spent as a result of, for example, these derechos going through Ontario, diverts resources. It diverts the resources from healthcare programs, from education, from social programs. It diverts resources, money, and attention to mitigation, to changing our energy systems so that they don't produce such dramatic effects. So there are all kinds of good reasons to pay more attention to adaptation, to undertake it. So for the rest of my presentation, I'm going to look at 4 areas of extreme weather and areas of impact that we're experiencing: extreme heat, flooding, windy storms, and wildfires. And for each of those, I'm going to look at what we need to do to adapt. So the first thing we need to do is to understand the problem. Then I'm going to look at adaptation at home. What do individuals and families, how can they adapt and make themselves safer in the face of climate extremes? Then I'm going to look at the local level, local organizations, community groups, and local governments. And then finally, I'm going to look at senior levels of government. I'm actually going to focus on the province because that's what I know best. And also because the province, in the division of powers between the provinces and the federal government, the provinces have more responsibilities for the kinds of infrastructure and the kinds of areas of jurisdiction that are impacted most by climate, by extreme weather. So starting with heat. Extreme heat, as I've indicated, can be deadly. The 617 people who died in BC's 2021 heat dome are an example. Most of those people died in their homes, which is why we really have to think about adaptation at the level of homes. They were seniors, they were people in substandard housing, there were people who didn't have cooling for the most part. They were people who were isolated individuals who didn't have partners in the home, didn't have family in the home, didn't have friends that might look in on them and take care of them. They were people with medical preconditions. So many workers were also and are also exposed. And these include people like farm workers. We have migrant farm workers in Ontario, for example, who are not only exposed to a lot of heat in the fields and in their greenhouses where they work, but they're also exposed in the migrant farm worker housing. Actually, sometimes their housing is hotter than the conditions in the fields. Roofers, road workers, and construction workers are also exposed to extreme heat and have very little in the way of protection by their employers or by the government. And it is going to get worse. So we really have to think about ways to adapt. Just want to give a word about heat domes. Heat domes are among the expressions that are kind of new to weather reporting. We have heat domes, we have atmospheric rivers. There's a new thing that I just saw in the papers the other day. Actually, Susan, you mentioned it today. It's I'm sorry, I've forgotten it, and I'm not going to try to recover it. But anyway, a heat dome works this way. You have a mass of warm air that's built up in still and dry summer conditions. You know, those kinds of days when you have high pressure, clear skies, and you start to see the ground gets drier and the heat starts to build. Then you have the high pressure in the atmosphere, which pushes that warm air down, and it literally compresses the air. which gets even hotter as a result of that. And if you have that heat dome over extended periods, 4 days, 5 days, a week, 2 weeks, as has been happening more, then people's ability to be resilient in that gets reduced. Now, recently, the County of Haliburton did a couple of climate change reports, which I'm going to discuss more later. And one of the reports looked at temperature projections for the area and showed that there are likely to be 4.4 degrees C increase in mean temperatures in Haliburton in the next 20 to 30 years. In addition to that, there are going to be 38 hot days, that is over 30 degrees, compared to about 14 or 15, which occur now. So those kinds of heat situations are going to increase dramatically in Haliburton. So what can we do about it? Well, first of all, we have to look at those things, like what are the climate projections and what are the heat that's likely to occur. But there's also something we can call heat risk mapping. There's a U of T group that's been doing heat mapping they've done heat mapping for about 150 towns and cities in Canada. And the heat mapping looks at areas of a town that are not covered, for example, don't have much tree canopy or no tree canopy. They're all asphalt and concrete, but are also areas where poorer people tend to live. So poorer people, if you look at cities across the country, tend not to have trees in their neighborhoods. They tend not to have parks. They tend not to have ponds and rivers going through, areas that provide some cooling from that. So you can do the map where you can overlay the layers of the low-income areas with tree canopies, and actually measure temperatures in those kinds of areas and come up with a map that indicates where the hot areas are in the town, where you can begin to target your adaptation work. So this map, you can't see it very well, but it's of North Bay. And there's an area there on the west of North Bay, which houses a lot of more vulnerable communities. And having that map, North Bay, if it was so inclined, could begin to figure out what to do in those communities first to begin to reduce their exposure to heat. The other thing that should and could be done is to assess heat in areas that house a lot of vulnerable populations. In long-term care, for example, a lot of long-term care, it turns out, a lot of those buildings do not have cooling in the buildings. And here you have a lot of vulnerable elderly adults, many with underlying medical conditions who are exposed to heat. Hospitals, there are still some hospitals, small hospitals, that don't have cooling. There are schools. I would say the majority of schools in Ontario do not have cooling and can reach very high temperatures. And children who are exposed to those temperatures are not only vulnerable in the sense of their health, but they can't learn when it's really hot. And childcare centers. So we need to be actually measuring the temperatures over time and the humidity in those environments to determine how hot they are, to know where we need to target our action. The other thing we need to do, and this is mainly on the responsibility of municipalities and the province, is to track and publish information on heat-related deaths. Quebec does this, by the way. And so sometimes you'll see a heat wave go through where Quebec will say, oh, we had 200 deaths in relation to this heat wave over the last 3 or 4 days. Ontario won't have any listed, or they'll have 2 or 3 listed. And it's because the coroner's office has never set up a system whereby people, doctors who are making out death certificates, for example, note that heat was a factor in those deaths. So we need to track and publish information on heat-related deaths, partly to know who to target, where to target, and also for the population at large to know what's happening. So what can be done at home or by individuals to adapt to extreme heat? Well, there's actually quite a lot of information out there. The SCAN, for example, has recently published a little 2-page extreme heat document called What You Need to Know. It talks about how to identify the symptoms of heat stress, heat exhaustion, and so on, but also advises you on things that you can do yourself to stay safe in extreme heat conditions. So one is stay hydrated. Keep cold water in the fridge. Don't just take it from the tap, but keep cold water from the fridge and drink a lot of it. Drink fluids with what's the word I'm looking for? Electrolytes as well. Take cool showers, and then if you don't have air conditioning, sit in front of a fan and it will cool you off. Have cold cloths. You can keep these in the refrigerator and put them on the back of your neck if you're heating up too much. There are a whole series of other things that these documents like the one on SCAN list. I'm not going to go into them all in detail. The other things you can do for your home over time are things like improving home insulation, having windows that open, and opening those windows at night when temperatures are lower. If the temperatures aren't lower than the outside, then the temperatures inside doesn't make any sense to open those windows. But if they are, opening the windows and letting the cooler air in. Shading windows, especially west-facing windows in the summer, which is where a lot of heat enters the home. Ideally, we would all have electric heat pumps that would both give us more energy-efficient heating than fossil fuels do in the winter months, but also would give us quite efficient cooling in the summer months. And this is something that we need to look into, but they are expensive. So it's vulnerable people who don't have much money, don't have many resources, are not going to be able to do all of these things to adapt by themselves. They need help. What could be done at the local government and community business level to adapt to extreme heat? Well, we can in our communities expand tree planting, for example, and taking care of trees so that they live longer. In the city of Toronto and in hot cities, new trees planted only last on average 7 or 8 years, so they actually don't get to the level where they can provide shade for people and cool the environment. So we need to expand tree planting. We need to take care of those trees. We need to expand green and blue spaces in our environments for cooling, and parks, especially in nature-deprived areas. We need to install cool and green roofs. So cool roofs are expanding. In New York City, for example, has a cool roof program where it's encouraging and incentivizing building owners to put white membranes on the roofs of their buildings that reflect solar radiation and cools the floors below, especially the upper floors, which tend to be the hottest floors in the buildings. Green roofs do a similar thing in a different way. The green roofs provide extra insulation to roofs, and they have plants on them. And they also absorb some moisture and keep moisture on the roofs that have a cooling effect in the buildings below. The other thing that they can do, and we can encourage those big box stores and so on to provide shade structures where people can rest, but also shade structures in parks if they don't have large trees or while you're waiting for those trees to grow. Water fountains and misting stations so that people in hot places can get out and into those areas and cool down. We need to install cool pavements, so both color of pavements will make a difference, but also green parking lots. It's very interesting here. I just wanted to show you in this graphic is a new building in Waterloo that has put shade structures in its parking lot, and the shade structures are topped by solar panels. And so it does two things. It both mitigates because it supplies energy to that building instead of fossil fuel heating or cooling. And lighting. It supplies energy to the building and reduces emissions on the one hand. On the other hand, it cools the area around by providing shade and reducing the radiation that's absorbed in asphalt parking lots. I wanted to also show you what a green parking lot can look like. The City of Toronto actually some time ago established standards for green parking lots. It hasn't, unfortunately, enforced the implementation of green parking lots anywhere, but they did talk about what it can look like. And so you can see in this parking lot that putting in these strips with trees can make quite a difference to the temperature that the parking lot gets to and to the heat that then's emitted to the surrounding area. The other thing you can put into green parking lots are shallow areas that absorb stormwater. So if you get an intense rainstorm, some of that water can be siphoned off into these low-lying swales, and some of which can be planted with greenery and so on that can reduce the impacts, flooding impacts on the community and the effects on stormwater systems that are overwhelmed by fast rain. For local agencies adapting to extreme heat, we need to press them to expand heat warnings and more effectively warn people who are vulnerable and to provide protection during heat waves. So we need more awareness campaigns on heat risks and how to stay safe. Those campaigns need to be targeted at people who are particularly vulnerable. We need to think about well-being checks on vulnerable people. This was instituted in Chicago. Chicago had a major heat wave in 1995 that killed something like 730 people. And after it occurred, community groups and working together with the city in Chicago instituted well-being checks on vulnerable people. So you're hot, you know your neighbor's hot, you know they're old, you know that they suffer from diseases and so on. You go and you knock on their door and you ask how they're doing. You may help them get to a cooling center, for example, if your community has it. And that's the third thing that I'd like to see communities doing more of is cooling centers. I used to kind of poo-poo the community centers because I just thought they were kind of a make-work thing. And in fact, cooling centers in many places don't work very well. They don't work because they're boring, because they're uncomfortable. People go in and they sit in these uncomfortable chairs and so on. They have no food. They don't necessarily have water. They don't provide electricity, or you can plug in your phone or your laptop if you have it to entertain yourself. They don't have those kinds of things. The picture that is shown here is of a cooling center that's operated by a church in Texas. And it actually deliberately set out to provide those amenities to attract people to the cooling center so they would actually use it. So we've had cooling centers in downtown Toronto that nobody ever goes to. They're hard to get to. They're in the business areas of the city. People who don't have vehicles aren't going to go there. And even if they have vehicles, the parking costs are so expensive, they don't want to drive down to it. They don't want to walk blocks and blocks and blocks through hot air to use cooling centers. So if we're going to use cooling centers as something which can help people adapt to extreme heat, we need to change them and we need to make them more attractive to people that would benefit from them. At the level of the province, I'm going to say that we really need to press our MPPs, and in most of our rural areas, the MPPs are Conservative members of Parliament, and they don't seem to have much interest in climate change. So we need to press them to pass our private members bill. The private members bill that produced together with Peter Tabuns of the NDP this year. It was tabled in the legislature in May. It's never got a second reading, and this government continues the way it is, it will not get a second reading and it will die on the order table. It lays out about 8 or 9 different actions that the government should do. Some of the things that they should do include setting a maximum temperature limit for rental units. So in the Residential Tenancies Act, to change that, at some point, the Residential Tenancy Act made sure that we had minimum heating temperatures in buildings. So when buildings got to a certain temperature, tenants were supplied with heating. We need to do the same for cooling. In order to get there, though, we need grants and incentives for housing retrofits, both individual housing in areas where people don't have a lot of money to improve the conditions of their housing and reduce heat, but also in apartment buildings that were built in the 60s and 70s and so on, and don't have, say, the electrical power sources that they would need to add active cooling to the building and to provide cooling for tenants. We need to pass protective legislation for workers. The Ontario Federation of Labour has a campaign going now about getting the province to pass protective legislation, which requires employers of workers who are at heat to provide them with breaks from heat, to provide shelters, to provide water, and other kinds of amenities that would reduce their impact and their heat stress. Okay, this is taking way too long, I think. I'm going to try to pick up speed. So I am just going to point here to how precipitation is projected to increase in Haliburton. On the right-hand side, this graphic was in one of the climate change reports that was done for Haliburton. So they're expecting a 9.9% increase in annual precipitation in Halifax. And despite that, there's going to be an increase in dry spells. So we'll get more of that precipitation fast and hard in thunderstorms and so on. And then between those events, we're going to get more dry spells, as we've seen, I think, this fall. And we're going to get more days in which we get massive amounts of water coming down. So floods and flooding are costly. They are the costliest climate impact that we have in Canada today. Ontario, as I've indicated before, had $1 billion plus in insured damage from floods. Now, this is insured damage. The Canadian Climate Institute has estimated that for every dollar spent in insured damage, there are $2 in uninsured damage in the province. And so insured damages don't even begin to show us exactly what the cost impacts are. Haliburton had 3 fairly major floods in 2013, again in 2017, and in 2019, and these are probably going to continue. This is downtown Minden in 2013, which Minden, as Sue told me today, is in a floodplain, and the river rises when you get these intense rainfalls, and it spills and spreads over the area around it. Winter rains on snow, which we're getting more winter rains because the temperatures are going up in the winter, and it lands on snow and on frozen ground, then it has to go somewhere. We see, with intense rainfalls, rising waters that flow over onto floodplains, as they did in Minden. The other thing that happens is overwhelmed stormwater systems begin to back up water into basements, particularly if the stormwater system and the sewage system are in the same pipes. There's more and more limited insurance coverage. One business owner in Minden had both her business and her home flooded in this 2013 flood. She actually had insurance for her business, but she didn't have for her home. So she bore the costs and tens of thousands of dollars of the impacts of the floods on her house. Of course, floods can cause damage to buildings, roads, culverts, and bridges as well that need to be repaired and replaced. So what can be done to adapt to floods? Well, first you need to understand the problem. One of the things you can do is to create flood maps. Now, this was done for Haliburton, for the Gull and Burnt River watersheds, which in fact cover much of the county. So the Ganaraska Conservation Authority undertook this with funding from the federal government, I should say. And between 2019 and 2024 did a lot of assessment of the whole region and developed floodplain maps for the region. They did a presentation in January this year to the County of Haliburton in which they produced this sample floodplain map. A lot of the stuff was beyond me. They have the kinds of graphics they used were difficult to understand if you weren't technically adept. But they have this done, and they've done this major report. It's not online anywhere that I can find. I've asked the County of Haliburton to provide the report to me and have had no answer from them. I haven't yet asked the Ganaraska Conservation Authorities to give me that report, but I will. But it's really important for that information to get out and for us to understand just how vulnerable we are, where the vulnerable areas are. So what can we begin to do in the absence of some of this information? Well, you can check your flood risk. You can look at what's happened in the past. And if you can access those flood risk maps and so on, you can check where's your home in relationship to it, and what are the possibilities that you are going to be affected by flooding. If you have basements, you can install and maintain sump pumps and backflow valves. The backflow valves stop sewage from coming back up into your basement if the pipes get full. You can move valuables to higher floors. Don't keep your valuable electronics and so on down in the basement if you have a chance of flooding. It's also suggested that you elevate your furnace and your water heater if they're down in your basement. I'm not sure how many people actually have the opportunity to do that, but if you can, it's not a bad idea. You extend downspouts away from your house so that the water isn't saturating the land right beside the house and then seeping into your basement that way. And you grade soil to slope away from the foundation for the same reasons. So on the local government front, you need to ask for flood risk assessments and flood safety advice. Local communities need to, in their planning departments and so on, need to prevent any new construction in floodplains. And where it's possible, and it's hard because municipalities don't have a lot of money to spare, it's to, if people have been flooded more than once, to suggest that they move. I know in a county in Washington State, where they had houses that were flooded and severely damaged by floods and looked to be vulnerable to be flooded again, the county actually bought the property and turned it into parkland. I don't know to what extent we can do that. We can't do it unless municipalities have a lot more money than they have now. We need to integrate climate projections in infrastructure work. So we see bridges and culverts and roads being taken out by climate change and being built back to the same conditions they had before, which is crazy. If you're going to rebuild those things, then you should be looking at climate projections for the future, and you should be building more resilient infrastructure so that if those conditions occur again, the damage doesn't occur again. You need to protect local wetlands, and I'm not going to get into that anymore. I think if you want, I can refer to that more when we come to the question and answer thing. So what can be done at the level of the provincial government? Pass Bill 198. As much as we had 8 or 9 measures that the provincial government could do to protect us from extreme heat, I have even more in there to protect us from flooding. It includes some of the following: restore the powers and budgets of conservation authorities. Conservation authorities were established in Ontario to protect us against flooding. They were set up after Hurricane Hazel in 52 or 53 flooded large parts of the city of Toronto. And for a long time, they could do their job. But in the last 15 or 20 years, both the Liberal and the Conservative governments have cut their budgets. And recently, the Ford government has cut the powers of conservation authorities to assert their authority and reduce construction in flood zones and so on. The province can implement Ontario's wetland conservation strategy. Wetlands are critical for absorbing moisture in rainfall and keeping it off our streets and out of our houses. We have a wetlands conservation strategy. It's not a bad strategy, but it's sitting on the books and it's never been implemented by the province. We can fund flood protection measures by municipalities and homeowners in high risk areas for flooding. We can ensure flood forecasting and early alerts are active across the province. One of the things that happened in BC's atmospheric river was a lot of communities didn't get flood warnings until the floods were already upon them, partly because the province left it to individual communities. The province needs to take responsibility for that and make sure that people are warned in ahead of time and can evacuate when needed. And they need to fund flood recovery for municipalities and residents. Okay, I'm going to move on to storms. Storms, as I've indicated, have increased in number, intensity, and the range. We see winter snowstorms. Winter isn't going to go away completely with climate change. And especially around the Great Lakes, we have these lake effect storms, where these snow occurs in blizzards across the area and causes all kinds of accidents, causes power outages, and so on. We get a lot more freezing rain in winter too, and we know what that causes. We get these thunderstorm squalls as well, like we saw that caused the derechos across southern Ontario earlier this year and last year, which have stronger and less predictable winds, hail, and so on. We have a tornado corridor in Ontario that comes up from Windsor and goes east across to the Ottawa area. And that corridor is widening now. We're getting more and more tornadoes outside of those, that initial corridor where we used to get 15 or 20 small tornadoes in a year. And those tornadoes are getting more impactful. And we're seeing hurricanes reaching farther north. So what are the kinds of impacts? Well, this is the iconic ice storm photo of 1998. We haven't seen anything quite as bad as this in terms of ice storms since that time, but it took power out for 3 to 4 weeks for a lot of areas in Quebec and Ontario. And the cost to fix the power lines and so on was dramatic. We get from storms major accidents, injuries, and deaths, as we know. We get buildings, trees, woodlands, and shorelines all damaged through storm impacts. We see economic losses from work and business disruptions, and we see rising insurance premiums and more restricted insurance coverage. So there's more areas that insurers won't cover, and there's more restrictions in the areas that they do cover about how much they'll cover and what they'll cover. And this is becoming a real problem for many people. I had a personal experience recently on June 13th, and some of you may have had this experience as well. We have a cottage, our family has a cottage in the Haliburton area. And on June the 13th, the Weather Network Storm Center warned of severe thunderstorms, damaging wind gusts, large hail, possible tornadoes, and torrential rains for the Haliburton region. And that did come about. We're not quite sure if a tornado occurred or not. Something called the Northern Tornado Project, which is a project of Western University, has been looking at that, but they haven't really pronounced on whether that was a tornado that come through or just heavy wind gusts. Those gusts caused more than 20,000 power outages, and 6 tornadoes were later confirmed on the Ontario-Quebec border. This picture is of our property. That's our cottage down below. And it took out dozens of trees, felled those trees, tipped them over, and those trees, the large trees, took out many other trees and so on. It took out our woodshed. Our woodshed saved the roof of our house, fortunately, from being hit. And it took out our electricity, just tore the lines right off the house and tore down the local power lines. Cost $4,500 to us for us to fix things at our house. About $2,500 was covered by insurance. Still, we were lucky compared to a lot of others. And we're lucky because we have some money and we can finance it. So what can be done to adapt to storms? First of all, understand the problem. You look at past extreme storms, how they've impacted you, your neighborhood and communities like yours, and you need to pay particular attention to power outages and what their impacts are. In winter, in extreme heat, those power outages can be very damaging. The other thing you can do is check out what other communities have done to protect homes, public buildings, facilities, and parks. There's a report that the provincial government commissioned back in 2020 that was completed in 2023, but has never been put on the government's website. We members, sent in a whole host of freedom of information requests. And after months and months of these requests, we actually got this report released to us. The government has still not put it on its website, but it is now on our website. And this report, it's very long. It's very long. That's all I'm going to say. It has lots of good information in it. It's got lots of ideas about what other communities have done to protect against a whole variety of climate extreme weather. And we can begin to think, oh, if they're doing this in California, maybe we can do it here. If they're doing this in Germany or France or the UK, maybe it would work in our communities. So you can look at those kinds of things to understand the problem and to understand what some of the solutions are. At home, you can think about what to do to adapt to storms. The Government of Canada has on its website a pamphlet on severe storms and what to do if it's coming to you and how to be safe. When to leave your house, when to hunker down in the basement, what to do about your windows and storms. But you can also keep your eye on weather warnings and take them seriously. Don't get in your car and go out driving if there's going to be a major storm coming through. I'm going to stop that kind of line of discussion. You should also think about investigating power backup systems if you can afford to do so. And consider battery storage rather than diesel generators, for God's sakes. You know, one of the things that happens on our lake when the power goes out, which it does pretty frequently, is this sudden drone occurs as the diesel generators all over the lake come on, despite the fact that for the most part, the cottagers aren't even at their places, and they're emitting huge amounts of greenhouse gas emissions. So consider battery storage if you can, rather than diesel generators. Secure your roof using hurricane straps. I'm going to go to it. There's this little thing called a hurricane strap. It's a little piece of metal. It's really about 6 inches tall, maybe, and it fastens the upright members of your wall. This isn't a very good picture because it doesn't show it with an upright member to the roof members. And it makes a huge difference if you get a big wind that comes up under your eave and tries to take your roof off. The Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction has tried for more than 20 years to get these simple, powerful tools into the Ontario Building Code, but Construction companies have fought against it, and the Ontario government has not done it. It's craziness. If you can do it individually, if you have an attic that's open and you can see whether the roof members are attached to the side walls and you see they're not, install these things. They're not hard to install, they're not costly, and they make a big difference. So what else can you do with respect to local governments? And one of the things that you can ask them to do is to create a record of damage from extreme weather and to identify the vulnerabilities in the community to inform the action that they need to take. They need to take into account climate predictions when they're repairing, upgrading, or building new local infrastructure. It doesn't make any sense to repair that road the same way it was before and know that it's vulnerable to climate change. And to make municipal facilities available to help and house residents affected by storms. And again, you need to press your MPPs and the provincial government to update the building code and its critical infrastructure programs and plan for energy resilience to minimize and recover from power disruptions. You do that by diversifying and decentralizing energy sources, by increasing energy storage, by expanding smart grids and demand response programs. So Susan and Terry, I'm going to ask you here. I still have several slides to go. I've gone over time. Should I just press on?
How many slides have you got left?
Not too many. I've got about 9 or 10.
Okay.
I can try to move faster. The next section is about wildfires.
Yeah.
And then looking at some Halliburton climate change documents.
I'll leave it to you. If you can summarize, great. If not, carry on.
Okay, I'll try to be quick. So we know about the craziness of new wildfires, unprecedented wildfires across Canada last year, 6,000 of them, 37 million acres, 29 megafires. So adapting to wildfires, we need to understand the problem. The World Weather Attribution Team, which included 2 Canada Forest Service scientists, calculated that climate change doubled the likelihood of the 2023 fire season, and that's going to continue. We see that increased heat, drought, lighting, and storms are largely to blame. Now, you get people like Doug Ford saying, oh, it's people throwing their cigarettes out, and it's people not taking care of their campfires that are causing these fires. It's true. There are idiots who are out there, and there's people who aren't idiots who inadvertently sent the fires, but they wouldn't get to nearly the extent that we have if we didn't have this increased heat, drought that's drying up the lands that forests are in, and lightning storms that are occurring more and more and more frequently are setting off these fires. We also are expanding the wildland-urban interface. Most of us in the Halliburton area are in this interface, and the more houses and building and so on do you have in that interface, the more likely you are to be affected by wildfires. Forestry practices also affect wildfires, and I'm not going to go into that. So at home, what you can do, well, there's a set of programs called Fire Smart that were started by the insurance industry quite a number of years ago, and they promote a number of practices in and around your home that increase the safety for homes, and they've been more and more getting into Fire Smart for communities as well. And it's really worth checking out what you can do in your home. Some of those things I don't particularly want to do. For example, at our cottage, we have wood walls at the cottage, and they suggest maybe you should go to cement walls or something. I don't think that's going to happen, but there are trees in the immediate area. Is your barbecue sitting up right next to the house? And if it gets hit by flames, the propane tank is going to go up. Is your woodshed close to the house, and so on? So it advises you on things that you can do to make your home less susceptible. They also have an advanced home assessment program where you can get your home assessed by a trained assessor who can provide recommendations to increase your resilience. So they are more and more doing community fire smart programs too. One of the things that happened they have wildfire community preparedness days, for example, and there were 5 of these days in Haliburton last year. So it was mostly homeowners or cottagers associations that invited them in to do these wildfire preparedness, but brought together a lot of people to think about this. And this is really good because people become more attuned to climate change, but they also become more knowledgeable about ways to protect themselves and their neighborhoods and their communities from fire. I'm going to skip the neighborhood at program. So what can be done at the level of the province? Well, the province needs to expand year-round operations. Right now, Ontario Wildfire Management tends to operate only between April and October, but we're seeing more and more winter fires. We're seeing fires that smolder underground and underneath the snow in the winter, only to break out in the spring. And these need to be taken care of. And you need a permanent and well-paid workforce to do that. Wildfire workers rangers are not paid at the level that's commensurate with the danger or the knowledge that's required. And so they rotate through. Somebody will come in, they'll do it for a year or two, and then they'll go, and that experience is lost. And that's really important. You need for the province to reinstate environmental assessment, which they no longer require for logging and timber management, and to require climate change impact assessment of forestry. You need them to support active forest management, including prescribed and cultural burning practices, which Indigenous people used to do all the time. And some are returning to do in the areas under their jurisdiction, and that reduce wildfire fuels in forest zones. And you need to require regenerative reforestation after logging. The kind of reforestation that occurs after logging is terrible. It's generally coniferous trees. It's trees that are going to be used in the future for making paper and toilet paper and so on. It's not even going to be for wood that's timber for building or other purposes. And those places are much more susceptible to wildfires. I'm going to pass on that. So I want to do a note about Haliburton climate change programs. In 2019, Haliburton joined the Federation of Canadian Municipalities Partners for Climate Protection program, and it embarked on doing a series of plans. So the first plan was a climate change mitigation plan for reducing emissions in the area, and I didn't pay much attention to this because I'm focused on adaptation. They also did a corporate climate change adaptation plan. So this plan just looks at what the Haliburton County can do to reduce impacts on its own facilities and its own areas of work. So it's very limited. They were supposed to produce a third plan, a community mitigation and adaptation plan. So things that would keep people in the community safer, and they've never done that. The interesting thing was that not long after completing those first 2 plans, the county eliminated the climate change coordinator position. Duh! So this it's unconscionable. The county also says that project updates on these plans can be found on their weighed-in page. I've looked on the weighed-in page and I can't find any updates. So I think the plans were done and shelved. And that is really common. Ontario, there's at least 50 or 60 communities in Ontario that have done these kinds of plans, and almost none of them have implemented those plans. I'm not going to look at their corporate climate change plan. So the plan did identify 11 broad strategies in 4 areas of responsibility. So in the area of infrastructure and assets, recreation and natural environment, health and safety, and strategic planning. What's missing from that plan? They have a number of things that are of value to do, but there is no sense of urgency in this plan. There's no sense that, hey, these impacts are coming down on us and they're going to come down more intensely and more frequently, and we really need to act now, and we need to act to safeguard the community. There's no structure for ensuring that their commitments are met. There's no staff with clear climate change adaptation responsibilities. There's no cross-departmental oversight, and there's no budget for it. And there's no targets and deadlines. And these are the weaknesses of so many of these adaptation plans, and it's what we need to be pressing our communities and our local governments to do. So finally, and I'm so sorry it's taken so long, here's the challenge. You and we need to decide where in our lives we can act to increase safety and resilience. This might be at our home. This might be in our neighborhood and in our community, and it might be by pressing local and senior levels of government to do their jobs and safeguard us and their constituencies. And I want to say good luck with all of that.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
That's great. I really appreciate, Jennifer, the amount of effort that you put into that presentation, and you've had some challenges in your life in the last couple of weeks, and again, thank you so much for your presentation. Now, I didn't know until just a little while ago that Terry was going to be able to join us. So, Terry, I didn't mention it to you this earlier, but Andrea Percy has a question that she is going to ask. Andrea, do you want to unmute yourself and go ahead? There you go.
Okay, I don't know if I'll ask that question that I talked to you about.
Okay.
There's been a few others come out. There's a lot of it. I realize the politicians have huge responsibilities, and I've placed a lot of phone calls to the Premier's office, and I don't know where my thoughts landed. You know, you never do find out. He doesn't seem to be making any great changes, but the thing, well, actually, it was what I talked to you about. What I am concerned about is the fact that the people in the communities aren't mobilized. It isn't just the politicians that are responsible. I don't hear a lot. I've only recently begun to hear about climate change being mentioned on CBC. The Weather Network's doing a lot better and has done for a while. But, I live in a fairly conservative community right now, and I feel a little bit intimidated by the thought of even mentioning the word climate change around here. Like we all know the weather is totally different than it was last year. And it's on my lips to say, oh, it's climate change. But, CBC seems not to want to antagonize people with that choice bit of information, because that there's another side, out there waiting to polarize the situation. And I know that the media is particularly aware of that, but I would like to see more focus on disseminating the information, getting the media to talk about it more, getting people out there to talk about it more. That's my big issue.
I wish I could offer more advice. I think you can start not necessarily from climate change, but you can start from extreme weather. One of the things I meant to do here is to ask people in the chat when they were waiting for things to begin to say, well, how has extreme weather affected them in the last few years? Have they had an accident? Have they had a flood, has an area near them that they hold near and dear flooded. Were they affected by the pollution from the wildfires, and so on? And so sometimes I think you can start those conversations with people in your community from that perspective. What are you experiencing recently, and what do you think is causing it?
Well, it's really interesting. We have roofers. I'm in a condo development. It's townhomes, 24 in the community, and two-story, and all the places had to be re-roofed, and it took over a month because of the last hailstorm. So that took out a lot of the eaves troughs as well, and it's taken the guys a month, and I hope they don't have to go into the winter to finish it. And we were lucky enough that that's being covered by insurance because the costs would have been massive.
Yeah.
But our insurance will go up.
So,
Yeah.
you can ask those questions and you can eventually lead it back to climate change. But I spent a couple of months at a Climate Change Adaptation Center in Oxford in England, and they were invited to participate in the famous flower show, the Chelsea Flower Show in March. And we went in and set up a booth, and what we started with was saying to people, we would say, how has climate change affected your garden? And people would, oh, and then they'd start to talk about it. So you don't necessarily have to lead with climate change, although eventually you need to get around to it. But
it's a good idea. Thank you.
Yeah. Anyway, I hope that's helpful.
Yeah.
So Terry, is it okay if I let you take over your normal?
There's not a huge number of questions or comments in the chat, but there are a few, and but I'm not sure how to approach some of those questions. But someone from BC, I think she was joining us from BC, I mentioned the bomb cyclone, I guess is the term that's being used now. Having recently returned from BC on a train trip, I can attest to the fact that atmospheric rivers have now become a thing, a routine thing in British Columbia, and boy, the extremes are getting worse, and the damage is mounting. I guess one of the things that I wanted to maybe paraphrase some of these things about, in the chat was how community organizations or individuals that want to see action taken, collective action in their community, begin to have the kinds of conversations that would result in useful pressure being put on municipality to actually take the climate emergency seriously. I mean, Environment Halliburton, for example, has done a whole bunch of things which really come directly at it, declare a climate emergency, and then basically act as if there is one. Right? But that hasn't happened. One of the things that we tried to do was work with the climate change coordinator, Corey McKay, before she left and her position wasn't renewed, was to engage in really important conversations with various sections of our community, some of whom may not actually agree that there's a climate emergency, but sure as heck do recognize that we've had 300 or 400-year floods in the last 10 years. Yeah. There's consequences associated with that. So I guess one of the things I would like to ask is what do you think we should be saying to our elected officials, many of whom are conservative and are swayed by what Doug Ford is doing, and don't seem to be taking climate change very seriously? What can we do to mobilize to try to get them in a position where they are more amenable to doing the climate adaptation stuff that you're talking about?
You're probably not asking the right person here. I have never been. First of all, it's really hard to persuade certain groups of people. You can look at climate change people. There's people who absolutely deny climate change, and in my experience, there's no point arguing with them. So around adaptation, the advantage is you can just talk about extreme. We've got more and more extreme weather. Whether you believe in climate change or not, there's more and more extreme weather that we need to be protected against. And what can you do to help us with that? So that's one aspect of it is, but there's no point in arguing, I don't think, with climate deniers. There's a group called Reclimate that's operating out of, I think, the University of Ottawa, and a lot of people from the Maritimes are involved in it too, that's doing webinars recently about how to talk about climate. And I've only been able to attend one of these. I missed the second one, which I'm really sorry about, but it's really useful to advice about how to approach the discussions of these things. I'm by no means a communications expert. I'm not even really very good at the one-on-one communications or the communications with small groups that people suggest, like the kitchen table discussions and so on. I'm better at research and trying to put it together there. But really go to Reclimate and see what they advise. So they both do documents and so on that are really accessible. That you can, they're not hard to read. But they also do these webinars that provide really good and useful advice, and I would suggest using them as a resource.
Right. You mentioned that SCAN was involved with the creation of the private members bill that Peter Tabuns advanced in the Legislative Assembly.
Yeah.
And in that, I recall that there was some effort on Peter's part and on your part and others that were helping draft that legislation to provide money that would be available to communities to actually finance the implementation of their adaptation and mitigation plans. Because one of the things we hear back from politicians all the time is that they're strapped for cash.
Yeah.
They've got other incredibly important pressing issues to be looking at, and they're always short of money and being downloaded additional responsibilities from the province on their shoulders. So one of the things that I recall in that private members bill was some kind of a guaranteed fund that would actually be available to municipalities to fund the implementation of their climate change adaptation and mitigation plans.
Yeah.
Can you say a little bit about that as a possible way in which we can have some conversations, maybe not about the climate emergency directly, but adapting ourselves to the consequences of that in terms of getting municipalities on side to fight for that kind of a funding mechanism?
Yeah, I mean, there's the other alternative would be to actually give municipalities the ability. Toronto tried to get this many years ago under David Miller to get 1 cent off the HST to go to the city and increase the coffers of the city and so on. So there'd be a general measure like that. Yes, the bill proposed 4 different major aspects. So one was having the province actually acknowledge that climate change was a problem and developing a strategic plan. And the second one was creating a resource center, which municipalities and individuals and community groups and so on could use to find out more about all of these ways in which impacts occur and what are the possibilities in terms of adaptation. Quebec has such a resource center, but Ontario, the Liberals were trying to set it up at the time that the Ford government won the government, and the first thing that they did was to eliminate that resource center. So a resource center would be helpful too, and it might just help communities say, maybe you don't need to put a whole lot more money into this, but if you do it differently, things differently, then you're going to provide more protection for people. And then the third thing was the fund. So at the national level, the federal government has put money into funds for adaptation. It's way too little. And they've run out in some of those areas, but they do have pockets of funds that, in fact, Halliburton used to do the floodplain mapping, for example, so their disaster response planning and so on. So yes, I think we need to have a dedicated fund for adaptation. Given how costly it is, the province would be hard put, I think, to put that, even the province would be hard put to put that fund together. If they stopped spending money on stupid things, then, sorry, I'm just getting a little carried away here. Then, if they'd stop doing things like buying people's votes with this $200 package that's going out now to all of the residents of Ontario, then they could put money into these kinds of things. It's crazy, but I just don't see them doing it until there's a huge amount of pressure to do that. So every time there's an extreme weather event, I think we need to contact our MPPs and say, see, this has happened. This has cost us this amount of money. This has disrupted the businesses and the livelihoods of our community members. This is destroying our shorelines, and it's taken down our trees and so on. We want you to do something about it. And if you keep contacting them and pressing them, at some point they have to do something. At least I think so.
So there's a couple of specific questions which now have appeared in chat, which we've got a few minutes left. I think we should probably try to deal with these things. One of them has to do with, are you aware of individual actions that you've mentioned that result in the lowering of insurance premiums? In return for taking any of those actions, does your insurance premium actually get reduced? That's the first question. And the second one has to do with the hospital sector and the specific adaptations that people who are active in the hospital sector might advance, inside that system.
Oh boy, hard questions. I know that insurance companies, at some point, I haven't really looked at it recently, but they would, for example, lower insurance costs if you put in not a sump pump, but what was the other thing I mentioned?
Oh, the backflow valve?
The backflow valves and stuff like that. So they would definitely decrease your insurance if you had that. Whether that's happening now, I don't know. I'm just watching. I'm the president of my condo association, just small condo unit, and so I take care of the insurance bills, and which are about $10,000 a year at the moment. And this year, when the insurance papers came in, there were more and more and more exclusions, things that we couldn't claim if we had damage. I can't get into all the details right now, but so what's happening with insurance companies is they're losing money hand over fist. Particularly the reinsurance companies, the insurance companies that insure the insurance companies. So they're losing money, and consequently, they're cutting way back on what they will insure. So putting in some of the things that will protect your home more might stop some of your insurance costs from going up. Whether they'd reduce your insurance at this point in time, I can't tell you. So that's the insurance question. What was the second one, Terry?
To do with the hospital sector. Somebody is asking about what kind of specific adaptation proposals could be directed at the hospital sector.
I'm sorry, I really can't answer that. I'm a generalist in terms of adaptation, and I don't know everything about all of these things. So I mentioned
that some cases, small rural hospitals are not always cooled properly, or that their air conditioning systems are not up.
I actually think most hospitals in Ontario, I've been in all too many of them recently, do have cooling, which is good. So I misspoke when I said that hospitals needed to develop cooling. I think they do. I think one of the things that hospitals have to take into account is in things like the heat wave that occurred in BC and so on, is that they become overwhelmed. And with the shortage of emergency physicians now, and even nursing staff in a lot of hospitals, hospitals can get seriously backed up in extreme weather events and have trouble taking care of people who are out in the waiting room or in the corridors with injuries and illnesses caused by the extreme weather. And so one of the things that hospitals need to do is to look at how they can function in those kinds of situations. But to give you, I can't really give you an answer as to what those changes should be.
Okay, so I don't know, Susan, about how much longer we should try to continue the meeting, but there are a couple of questions that, or at least a couple of comments in chat, which we could mention. James Cushing, for example, said that in Mimico he can't get flood insurance, and his premium shot up by 25%. And he indicates that his comment is companies are getting out of insurance. There's not enough profit, especially in vulnerable areas. Yeah. So I think that that's probably reflecting a lot of things that are happening in jurisdictions that have a lot of vulnerability. I noticed that in Florida, for example, and South Carolina, there are areas where there's just simply, the insurance companies are completely backed out, and if there's not catastrophic insurance provided by the state, you're basically out of luck in terms of getting insurance coverage, or perhaps it's absolutely exorbitant rates. So, that's beginning to bite even in Toronto. That kind of situation, I take it flowing from the recent flooding experience in Toronto.
Yeah.
Okay. There's a question about conservation budgets having been cut. You want to just say something about that and about whether or not simply restoring those cuts is going to make a difference, or there's just something else have to happen in tandem with that?
Well, there's two things that have happened. One is that the budgets have been trimmed away, and that trimming started under the Liberals. So it's not just the Ford government that's done that. But they've also reduced the powers of the conservation authorities. So conservation authorities used to be able to say yay or nay to a number of developments in flood-prone areas or in areas that would affect flooding. And piece by piece, those powers have been diminished or taken away by the government and through various bills and so on. So the reduction in money budgets puts more pressure on municipalities that also contribute to conservation authority budgets, by the way. So it puts more pressure on the municipalities, but it reduces staffing in the conservation authorities, and then it reduces their ability to do what their job is to do, which is to protect us from flooding. I can't see really very much more.
Okay, Susan, I think that we'll probably leave it at that. Donald Cole has put a comment with respect to the question having to do with the hospital sector. He's put a reference in chat if people want to have a look at that. I think that what we'll do is take any resource suggestions that are put in chat, and when we get a copy of the recording that we send out to everybody who registered, we'll attach some of a list of those kinds of references in the email that comes to everybody. So I think probably with that, Jennifer, do you want to say something?
I wanted to say, Susan, I can supply you with a PDF of the presentation too. So people can take more time to look at each of the slides. There are a few resources mentioned in there. I thought if I'd had time, I would have done a whole resource list at the end, and I did not have time to do that in the last few weeks. But I think sending out a PDF might be useful.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you, Jennifer. I'm going to turn things back over to Susan for some final comments.
Okay, so I'd like to add my thanks, Jennifer, and I know that you put a ton of work into that, and the information-packed presentation, so thank you very much for that. I'd like to thank Terry for curating the question and answer period, And I just like to say that Environment Halliburton and SCAN continue to be able to do their work through memberships and donations. So if you feel inclined, we would certainly appreciate your contributions to that. And
I'm going to join and pay. I should have done it before now.
Anyway, and I'd like to thank all of our participants for joining us. And I think that will conclude our evening. And thanks again. And I wish you a good night.